For Session Update, I'm Shannon Lurkey. Several DFL senators and representatives from rural, educational, and technological organizations gathered to demonstrate support for the Senate's broadband funding request of $85 million. Spokespeople from groups such as the League of Minnesota Cities, Minnesota Farmers Union, and the Minnesota School Boards Association spoke of the necessity of broadband expansion across the state and praised Senator Matt Schmidt for his advocacy on the issue. Here's that press conference.
All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. We wanted to take this opportunity to spend a little time highlighting a priority of the state Senate this year, and that's broadband funding. There's been great discussion around the state over the last several years on how to address roughly 20% of greater Minnesotans that lack access to high-speed internet, whether it's for your home-based business or for telehealth or distance learning or precision agriculture. The applications for broadband are endless. But nonetheless, we've got about 20% of greater Minnesota homes and businesses in areas that lack access. And so today I wanted to highlight the provisions in our broadband article in the state Senate. We have $85 million for future round 3 of our border-to-border broadband fund. And with that, we have an updated speed goals off of the Governor's Task Force report, 25 by 3 by the year 2022 and 100 by 20 by 2026. And that means all homes and businesses in Minnesota, as a state speed goal, would have access to service at 25 by 3, 25 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload by 2022. Likewise, 100 megabits per second download, 20 megabits per second upload by 2026. And finally, we've applied those state speed goals to our definitions of unserved and underserved. So this approach is consistent with the way we created the fund in 2014. Excuse me. At this time, I'd like to take some comments from our other stakeholders here. Please step up to the microphone.
Good morning. My name is Kirk Schneider, Executive Director for the Minnesota School Boards Association, representing all the public school districts. And it was our association that passed a resolution that talks about supporting border-to-border broadband for our public school districts. We know that high-speed broadband is now a basic requirement of learning environments. It is essential as a textbook was 20 years ago. The big challenge is equal access for our districts and the affordability at home and school. This is a big disparity in the cost per student for lease fiber and purchasing bandwidth, especially where there is only one provider. Technology provides the potential to innovate, transform our schools. Fast, real-time, and dependable access equipment make these types of learning opportunities a reality for our districts. We know, for example, the availability for virtual field trips, self-directed, self-paced learning programs, mobility anywhere, anytime learning, individualized learning, online curricular resources, remote learning, low-incidence classes, for example, in our Chinese. And it would also, as we know today, as our kids walk around with these phones endlessly, would increase student engagement for our students and families. So the School Boards Association is in full support of a broader, more aggressive investment in our broadband, border-to-border broadband learning opportunities for our students.
Good morning, I'm Steve Fensky with the Minnesota Association of Townships. Our organization serves 1,780 townships throughout the state. It's home to about 950,000 Minnesotans. And these are the most rural places, people, businesses, and institutions in the state. Because of their distance from population centers, they are also the most unserved group when it comes to broadband. Despite that lack of service, it's becoming more and more of a necessity in every aspect of life, and in townships, it's no exception. Agriculture in particular, 21st century agriculture and businesses coming to demand broadband access. And every day that they go without it is another day where they're operating at a disadvantage in a global economy. Our concern as an organization is that the most rural places in the state will be left behind, that access will get to the population centers, even the small cities, and maybe the areas around there, but that the most rural places, the last farm, last home on the road, will get left out or will get left with yesterday's technology. I want to thank Senator Schmidt for his leadership on this. It's been critical, both in the bill and the attention that he continues to bring to it. we feel that the bill strives to reach the original goal of the program, which was to find funding for places that the market has been unwilling or unable to serve because of profit constraints. And this money is critical to getting that access. We see this really as no different than electrification in the 20th century. That was both costly and controversial, but I challenge anyone to consider a modern farm operating without electricity. It was critical to them operating. It's a critical piece of the state economy, and broadband is no different. The $85 million, we're very pleased to see that amount in the Senate bill because it takes both the scope of the problem and the urgency of the problem seriously. Thank you again, Senator.
Good morning. My name is David Unmacht. I'm the Executive Director of the League of Minnesota Cities. I've been in this position for 8 months now. I replaced a gentleman who was there for 22 years, who many of you knew or met over the course of your career, and that was Jim Miller. We're here in support of the $85 million investment in broadband, but before I do that, I want to tell two quick personal stories. Before I started at the League of Minnesota Cities, I worked with cities and counties throughout the state in another position. I traveled to Two Harbors, I traveled to Halleck, I traveled to Pipestone, I traveled to Wabasha, Rochester, and Red Wing, and I worked with cities and counties on a variety of things. But one of the things that I learned was how difficult it was when you're traveling throughout the state to access the internet, either uploading or downloading files or documents, sitting in cafes or restaurants or city halls or courthouses or truck stops, wherever it was, as a mobile consultant, if you will, someone who needed access to internet throughout the state of Minnesota. It was very difficult. So not only do I bring a professional perspective to this, but I also bring a personal observation to this. In my role as the new executive director, one of the priorities I have is traveling throughout the state and to talking with our city officials about their priorities. And two things are rising to the top right now. Infrastructure, but it's broadly defined. It isn't just defined by roads and sewers and storm waters, et cetera, et cetera. It's also defined by access to the internet, successful access to the internet in order to sustain communities and sustain jobs and sustain the livelihood of our communities in greater Minnesota. So infrastructure is changing how we define it, and our city officials are very concerned about that and the equity of that all throughout the state of Minnesota. The $85 million investment proposed in the Senate supplemental budget, in our opinion, from the League of Minnesota Cities, is a significant game changer. We view the border-to-border grant program not only as a way to address the inequity and issue of access, but also to help providers invest and upgrade their infrastructure in cities to enable economic development. And last night I was with the St. Cloud area joint cities, and there were 6 cities there, about 25, 30 elected officials, and we talked about information technology, and we talked about the significance of that and how it isn't just important for jobs and economic development, but quite frankly, it's really important for the sustainability of our small cities in the long-term future of our communities. They're really worried about it. The League of Minnesota Cities and our members have been deeply committed to increasing broadband throughout the state, from city officials serving on the governor's broadband task force 7 years ago until the present, advocating for the creation of the State Office of Broadband and Grant Program. Broadband is integral to local economies in delivering services. Ensuring economic vitality by providing essential infrastructure can be done in a variety of ways, including public-private partnerships, which the Senator has talked about, and he recently talked about that in our building with the Minnesota Association of Small Cities. We know that local communities are collaborating with many stakeholders to close the broadband gap, and this funding will enable more progress to be made. And finally, on behalf of the League, and we have 833 members, all but essentially 20 very small cities, we support the proposed investment of $85 million that will help in balancing equity of access across the state with developing local economies in our cities and communities. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. My name's David Mencken, and I'm chair of the Minnesota High Tech Association's Government Affairs Committee. And our organization represents over 300 small to medium to large technology-based businesses. So this is a big issue for us because it impacts a lot of our businesses that rely on the broadband internet to conduct business. And as many of you know in your personal professional lives, you know, access to broadband internet is probably more important today than it ever has been. However, as the Senator pointed out, you know, we have 20% of our rural communities that don't have access to broadband internet, which is a significant portion of the state of Minnesota. So we as an organization commend Senator Schmitz and the governor for making these types of investments, recognizing the importance of doing this within the state of Minnesota. Because at the end of the day, these investments will make Minnesota much more competitive than we are today, and it will provide better educational opportunities for our students, and will also make us have access to global marketplaces for our businesses. So we encourage all stakeholders in Minnesota to support the legislation, and thank you for having us today.